Okay, so the 9 myths that destroy your Pokemon investing profits. Now, I've compiled these from things I've just heard from time to time. And also, if you guys are new here, I'd like to say welcome to the channel. This is a place where we discuss collectibles, Pokemon, investing, trading card investments, and just general chit chats around new sets. Feel free to subscribe if it fits your vibe. Without further ado, the 9 myths of Pokemon investing. To kick off, number 1 is that vintage is superior to modern. Now, it is true that vintage is superior in pricing, but when thinking of investing, it really doesn't compare. Vintage has already had its boom. It may climb further in the future, but it's like placing your money in a sports star who's looking back at their career highlights. In terms of profit and investing, vintage is a super difficult market. If you're buying sealed packs or weighted packs, you need to be incredibly careful. I'd avoid Facebook Marketplace and other places that don't have like money back guarantees. Even as a seller, if you bought it off some random years ago, you can't even guarantee the legitimacy of your packs. Vintage sealed is real difficult. I prefer buying PSA graded copies of vintage cards. It's much safer. Now, if you're thinking of percentage growth, it's going to be super hard for vintage to double in price anytime soon. Also, some vintage cards have such extreme highs that they can fall in value far easier than modern. We can see this with Pokemon Emerald's Milotic EX from 2005. A PSA 10 sold in 2022 for $9,000 US, and another sold recently for $4,500. These price discrepancies are way too volatile because they compete in super high price markets. The prices can sometimes struggle to maintain their enormous highs. However, current modern products still have a whole generation and lifetime to appreciate, and could see some incredible growth in the coming years. A Fusion Strike booster box could easily increase 250% in value in the next 7 years. But with vintage, an enormous amount of growth potential has already been realized, and you'd need to risk far more money to have some skin in the game. There would need to be a whole nother boom to make those incredible gains that we've already seen. And for this reason, when it comes to investing, I definitely don't value vintage more than modern. However, for collecting purposes, vintage just nails it. There's really nothing quite like it. The feel of older cards are probably as close to perfect as you can get. And believe me, even with the crazy prices, there's actually still room for growth with vintage. I mean, imagine if Pokemon sees a 50-year anniversary or a 75-year anniversary. These are the cards that started it all. These are the first generation waves of card collecting. They still can grow, I mean, don't count them out, but modern has more potential to climb and it has less money needed up front. Myth number 2 is that sealed can't go down in value. Now, sealed maintains very well. However, it's not a safe bet. Reprints have happened as late as 3 years after a set's release. And truthfully, there isn't really a timeline for when reprints happen, nor is there any rhyme or reason when they decide to do it. They could even have heaps of stock available on shelves and decide to reprint. Just recently, the community was adamant that Sword and Shield sets were completely out of reprint territory because the Scarlet and Violet era moved to silver borders, so the printing machines couldn't print yellow borders anymore. I'm not sure where this rumor started, but this was a very common viewpoint amongst the community. And in mid-2023, Lost Origin and Silver Tempest got a huge wave of reprints, bumping stock way back up and crashing Giratina V by 35%. You had booster boxes drop in value. It went from struggling to get Lost Origin, and then after the reprint, you were able to pick it up for a discount. Anyone who was holding Lost Origin and made any small gains just had their profits delayed by another year or two, and they still haven't reached the previous levels as of yet. When reprint territory is completely out of the question, then sealed is far more stable. But the problem is, no one knows when that is. As recently as last year in the US, Evolving Skies had ETBs stocked across Walmart shelves randomly. I even saw Evolving Skies loose packs in Kmart in Australia, and they were marked as back order items. You can also pick up tins in some parts of Australia with loose Evolving Skies packs inside. So sealed is great, but it's a very long-term hold, and reprints are something no one can predict. No matter how many rumors you hear or what people come up with, reprints can and most likely will happen. If there's anything I've learned, Pokemon does what Pokemon decides to do, and there's no predicting what they're going to do next. Okay, now myth number 3 is that Pokemon is a hobby, not an investment. Now I wanted to ask you who decided that, as if there's a law governing whether collectibles can be seen as an investment or not. Here's a little secret. Collectibles as investments is nothing new, and it's not isolated to trading cards. Collectibles that appreciate have been around for years, from antiques to music records, vintage dolls, postage stamps, coins, you name it. I even got an email from my tax agent regarding collectibles, as they have a specific way they get taxed, showing you how popular they are as an investment. Pokemon seems to gather more scrutiny around this subject because I personally feel it's because the words Pokemon and investing cannot be placed together in a sentence without raising eyebrows. But the reality is investments don't have a rule, nor does Pokemon get some magic ticket from not being part of it because it's just Pokemon. Pokemon, just like any other brand, can become collectible. The reality is, and the way you got to think about it, is you're not paying for the cardboard or the card. You're paying for the collectible. This is the key difference to understand. Why does the GameCube fetch a higher price than the Wii when the Wii can play GameCube games? The logical and analytical mind doesn't apply much to collectibles. Those who try to think too linear when thinking of collectibles usually aren't the right match for investing. Collectibles are ideas, scarcity, and rarity multiplied with market demand. They have little to do with logic. That's why there's a market for misprint cards and miscut cards. These are actual errors that, if they were spotted in production, those cards would go in the bin. But because there's an oversight, they become collectible, and then they can fetch huge prices. So don't worry about Pokemon not being an investment. That rule cannot be applied to Pokemon or anything else really for that matter. If there's a market and they can sell, then by design, it becomes investable. If they cannot sell and there's no market demand, then the investment dies. It's all governed by the most simple economic rule to ever exist: supply and demand. Now, myth number 4 is that PSA population reports are the most important thing to a card's success. Now, this one is finicky because very low pop reports do matter. In fact, they matter a lot. So this rule doesn't apply when there's very low population reports. I mean, there's no denying if a card that has 50 PSA 10s and it's really sought after, the price will be high. So I'm not going to argue with you there. But I'm talking about high PSA pop reports of highly desired cards, like Lugia V and Umbreon VMAX. You see, a funny thing happens when there's such a high pop report. There becomes like a turning point in the market, and the card begins to feel oddly accessible. It almost feels like if you're collecting, then owning this becomes a rite of passage, and they're almost needed to be in your collection. So what happens is they don't become entirely out of reach. There's a sense that you can actually acquire this card in your collection. So, I mean, for the general population, a PSA 10 first edition base set Charizard is completely out of the question. So an enormous part of the market doesn't even bother to compete there. However, when cards have pop reports that are high and they're in demand, the reverse happens. It feels like these cards are easy to get, but in reality, even though something like Blaziken VMAX has a pop report of like 2,700 or 3,000, that's still so low, man. Like, with the amount of collectors out there, having only 3,000 copies of one card in PSA 10 is crazy low. Like, there's Nintendo Switch Games, a company called Limited Run Games, and they only print 2,000 to 3,000 copies and they get sold out in seconds. Yet with pop reports, we see 2,000 PSA 10s or 3,000 as high. The reality is that there's millions of Pokemon collectors, and don't ever underestimate how many collectors this hobby has. Umbreon's high pop reports have had really no effects on the pricing. In fact, it's become a rite of passage that if you collect Pokemon cards and you're serious, you really should own the PSA 10 of this card. So high pop reports don't always illustrate the full picture. The higher pop reports sometimes make the cards feel more attainable for the average Joe. I mean, a good example of this is Pokemon Soul Silver and Heart Gold. They sold something like 12.7 million copies, and used copies still fetched prices like 3 to 4 times the retail price. There's obviously not a shortage, it just comes down to a demand thing. And not only that, as time goes on, some collectors will lose their copies, some get misplaced. Things happen and those numbers don't even seem that accurate anymore. So PSA pop reports aren't the be all and end all. Okay, so myth number 5 is that modern expensive cards that grade PSA 7 or under become worthless. So let me just give you an example. You send your cards to grade. You pack them, you inspect them, you're looking at them, and you're pretty sure that these are gonna come back at least a 9 or a 10. You wait 12 weeks, you get them in the mail. When you finally receive your grades, you look at them, and one of your cards got a 7. Now, before you panic, hold your horses. Let me introduce you to the concept of binder collectors. You see, when I get a copy of an expensive card graded and it comes back a PSA 6 or 7, I don't complain too much. You can actually see this in one of my videos where I send the Giratina V and it's shocking grade. Honestly, it was atrocious. But more to the point, let me tell you why receiving these grades can actually be oddly advantageous. Sometimes with the naked eye, imperfections, surface issues, dents, they can actually be really hard to see, and you need to inspect the card super well. And even then, depending on the card's artwork and the colors that it was printed on, you might not even be able to tell. Something that you might deem as a mint or near mint copy, you might list that on eBay. And after the sale, the buyer may see an issue or dent that you couldn't spot. Now, congratulations, you've just opened yourself a can of worms. However, when the card is graded a PSA 6 or 7 and it's returned to you, the buyer that purchases the copy won't complain. They knew the grade. So if they look at the PSA 7 and it looks bad, well, there's really nothing to it. They knew what they were buying. Not only that, but very sought after cards that score low actually have a market of buyers fetching these low grades, because some collectors don't even care about the score. They just want to add these cards to their master sets or add them in a binder collection. So they'll actually actively look for the PSA 6s and 7s to crack them out of the slab and put in their binders. This is because PSA 6s and 7s sell for lower prices than raw. So if you do get a bad grade, don't be too bummed. You should be actually grateful that you could have avoided a headache in the future. Myth number 6 is that the size of your collection is important. I mean, like all collectibles, there's a lot of trash. Just because something is a Pokemon card that's shiny doesn't make it valuable. There are millions of cards printed, and having a ton of low value cards really doesn't do anything. In fact, it becomes more cumbersome as you probably won't be motivated to sell them all later on. When I look at collections, there's a few areas I focus on. Number 1 is how valuable is the collectible? Number 2, does it have room for growth? And number 3, how popular is it? You also got to think if it's liquid and if it sells well, because when it comes to selling, that's an important part. There's some cards that fetch enormous prices, but really the buyer market for them is small and niche. These are okay, but if you're thinking of these as an investment, you'd really want it to be decently popular and have a big buyer market. I'm a super big believer in leaning out your collections to be more highly priced and easy to move. There's a ton of singles and products that fit into this category, and you can watch other videos on my channel where I explore these. But for the sake of this video, I'd just say avoid grabbing anything and everything and thinking, oh, one day this is going to be worth bank. Rather it be liquid. What I mean by that is once you list it, there's a lot of people interested in that collectible. Now, myth number 7 is modern cards will one day be worthless. Honestly, this one's my favorite out there because I hear this all the time. The greatest interest ever in the history of the trading card game for Pokemon is right now. It literally is a new era. Modern cards will have a very hard time becoming worthless because modern chase cards are just way harder to pull. The cards that are rare in packs today are infinitely harder to pull. I mean, Evolving Skies was actually known as Evolving Cries for a reason. People during the Sword and Shield era were ripping booster boxes of Chilling Reign and not getting one single hit. Modern has a place, and people who romanticize older sets need to think ahead and just welcome in the new, because the modern artworks of today are actually super incredible. Now, myth number 8 is that card grading is overrated. Like, the problem with card grading is that the margins for error are so thin. But like any business or service, mistakes are going to happen. And if they do happen, it becomes like world news within the trading card community, because we have this belief that they shouldn't happen. Just like when Giratina V got enclosed upside down by accident. Card grading, especially from one of the big 3 trusted brands, is worth it. It's legitimate and it's a great way to look after your cards and to get an evaluation. Generally, they're super safe to use and there's hundreds of good reasons why to get your cards graded. Now, video game grading, that's another story. I'm happy to debate on that. Okay, and finally, myth number 9. Pokemon has already had its growth. Future growth won't happen. I love this one, and I also love the psychology of how people are wired to think. For some reason, we tend to think when things happen in the past, it could have only happened in that time and it's impossible to repeat in the future. You'll see this all the time, not even related to Pokemon investing. People will say, oh, don't bother with starting that business because that time when it boomed was years ago. Or house prices won't continue to go up. They've had their boom. Or there's no point making a YouTube channel because there's already millions of people doing that and it's impossible to grow. The time to do that was way before. The irony is that we always actually seek new experiences, new adventures, and we love welcoming new things. Pokemon cards and collectibles are no different. People tend to embrace the new. The reality is the COVID boom has made this era of Pokemon cards reinvent themselves. They really stepped up. Pokemon didn't just ride the new wave of interest. They excelled. They were releasing new sets like Celebrations, Evolving Skies, and Lost Origin to ride the new wave. They're not just letting the hype slip through their fingers. As much as people like to complain about Pokemon, when it comes to capitalizing on hype, they are true masters at it. These cards today, with all the hype around them, will have millions of people who will likely want to revisit these sets. Even though current sets are popular, most people don't have the mindset to hold on to sealed product It takes a lot of discipline. You got to remember, you're into the hobby. So the fact that you're even watching a video on Pokemon investing makes you very different to the general consumer. Do you really think most people who rip packs also keep one sealed? So guys, I hope that video was helpful and insightful. If you do love Pokemon collecting and investing and discussions around these topics, feel free to subscribe. Honestly, I'd love to have you on board the channel. Thanks heaps guys, and I'll see you on the next video. Peace.